In the tranquil town of Jonzac, France, life moved at a peaceful pace. Families strolled through quaint streets, neighbors greeted each other with warm smiles, and children played without a care. Among these families was a quiet surgeon named Dr. Joël Le Scouarnec, a man respected by many and trusted by all. His unassuming nature and professional reputation made him a comforting presence in the community. But in 2017, this idyllic image was shattered by a whisper that would expose a darkness lurking beneath the surface. One summer afternoon, a 6-year-old girl confided in her parents about something unsettling. She described inappropriate actions by the man next door, someone her parents knew as the friendly doctor who had often waved at them from across the fence. At first, disbelief took hold. How could this be true? Could a respected surgeon be capable of such acts? It was a horrifying thought, one that no parent wanted to believe. But the child was unwavering. Her words, innocent yet powerful, painted a picture that demanded attention. It wasn't just the unsettling nature of the accusation, it was the gravity of who was being accused. This was a man who had dedicated his life to healing others, someone who had taken an oath to do no harm. Could he truly be guilty of what this child claimed? When the police were alerted, they faced a delicate situation. Investigating a well-known surgeon based on the testimony of a young child was a daunting task. Yet they could not ignore the possibility that something sinister was at play. After obtaining a search warrant, officers arrived at Dr. Le Scouarnec's residence, hoping that the child's account was a misunderstanding. What they found, however, would forever change their perception of this quiet town and its trusted Dr. Curry. Was this the end of a tragic misunderstanding or the beginning of a terrifying discovery? Stepping into Dr. Le Scouarnec's home, investigators were met with an unsettling silence. The rooms were meticulously tidy, the air heavy with an eerie stillness. As they searched, their eyes caught sight of what seemed like ordinary notebooks, tucked away in drawers and stacked neatly on shelves. But as they flipped through the pages, ordinary quickly turned into ominous. What secrets could these diaries hold? With each page turned, the truth became more unbearable. These were not harmless journals, they were detailed accounts, chronicling actions that no one could have imagined. Carefully written entries revealed names, dates, and chilling descriptions. The words danced across the paper, turning a quiet home into a monument of hidden horrors. Why would a man of his stature keep such records? Was it arrogance, a need for control, or something even darker? These diaries suggested that the doctor had a long history of crossing boundaries that should never be crossed. But this revelation posed another haunting question. If these were the records he kept, how many other secrets lay hidden, unrecorded, in the shadows of his life? Could this trusted surgeon have lived a double life for so long without anyone noticing? The discovery of these diaries shifted the investigation into overdrive. What began as a single accusation had now transformed into a case that seemed to stretch far beyond one small town. And as authorities delved deeper, it became clear that this was not a case of one isolated incident. What did the neighbors truly know about Dr. Le Scouarnec? Did anyone ever suspect the darkness behind his gentle demeanor? Dr. Joël Le Scouarnec had built a career in medicine, moving from hospital to hospital, always leaving behind a trail of praise and respect. To his colleagues, he was a quiet professional dedicated to his patients. To his community, he was the kindly neighbor who blended into the fabric of daily life. But as the investigation continued, a horrifying narrative began to emerge, a narrative that turned admiration into disgust. How does someone so trusted become someone so feared? Investigators uncovered more than just diaries. They found a history of exploitation that had been hiding in plain sight. His positions in various hospitals provided access, and his reputation offered cover. It became apparent that his acts were not impulsive, but calculated, a pattern of behavior shielded by his medical career. What allowed him to operate for so many years without being caught? Was it the inherent trust people place in doctors, or the reluctance to believe that evil could wear a friendly face? As the public learned of these discoveries, shock turned into outrage. The man they once trusted with their lives and the lives of their children was now revealed as someone who had betrayed that trust in the most unforgivable ways. The facade of the dedicated doctor had crumbled, revealing the true nature of a man who had manipulated his position for sinister purposes. How many others are out there like him, blending into their communities, hiding behind professions meant to protect and heal? The more investigators examined the handwritten journals, the more disturbing the reality became. These weren't just the ramblings of a disturbed mind. These were records precise, calculated, and shockingly detailed. Each entry described events spanning over 25 years, documenting people, places, and occurrences with a methodical precision that sent chills down the spines of investigators. Why would someone do this? Was it arrogance? A way to relive what he had done? A trophy collection disguised as ink on paper? Or was it something even more twisted? The depth of detail suggested a man who wanted control, total control. By writing down his actions, he wasn't just remembering them, he was reinforcing them, reliving them, preserving them as a personal legacy. But another chilling realization soon followed. If these diaries were confessions, they could also be a roadmap to more victims, people who never knew what had happened to them. The question now wasn't just what he had done, but how far it had spread, and who else was about to learn that they had been part of his hidden nightmare. As authorities pored over the journals, a horrifying truth emerged. Many of the people listed in the pages had no idea they had been victims. Some names belonged to hospital patients, people who had undergone surgeries under Dr. Le Scouarnec's care. Some were children from his personal life, nieces, neighbors, family acquaintances. And the most chilling part, some victims had been under anesthesia when it happened. Imagine waking up from a medical procedure, trusting that everything had gone as expected, only to learn years later that something unimaginable had taken place while you were unconscious. How do you process that? How do you even begin to comprehend it? For others, the trauma had been buried under the weight of time. Some had been too young to understand what had happened to them. Their memories were hazy, distorted, or blocked out entirely. But now, with the diaries as evidence, investigators had a duty to contact those whose names appeared in the pages. And so, one by one, people received a call that would change their lives forever. How do you tell someone they were a victim of something they never knew happened? How do you prepare them for a truth that will shatter everything they believed about their past? For many, the calls from investigators were met with shock, confusion, disbelief. Some victims had long suspected something was wrong, a vague, lingering unease that they had tried to suppress for years. But when they had spoken up, no one had believed them. Others had buried their memories so deep that even being told what had happened wasn't enough to bring it back. They had erased the trauma without even realizing it. And then there were those who had no memory of him at all. Their names had appeared in his diaries, but to them he was a stranger, a faceless figure in the past. But how could that be? Had he gone undetected for so long that entire lives had been affected without people even knowing it? As each call was made, investigators were forced to confront another devastating truth. Warnings had been ignored. People had spoken up before. They had raised concerns. Some had felt uncomfortable around him. Others had noticed red flags, but no one had listened. Now, the question was unavoidable. If someone had taken action sooner, how many lives could have been spared? And more disturbingly, how many others are still out there waiting to be heard? Just when investigators thought the case couldn't get any worse, a shocking revelation emerged. Dr. Joël Le Scouarnec had been caught before. In 2005, more than a decade before his arrest in Jonzac, he had been convicted of possessing illegal material involving minors. This should have been enough to end his career. A conviction like that should have barred him from working in any medical facility, let alone treating patients. But it didn't. Instead of being permanently removed from the medical field, he served a short suspension. When his sentence was completed, he was quietly allowed to return to work. How does this happen? How does someone with a documented history of misconduct get reinstated in a profession built on trust? The truth was as horrifying as it was simple. There were gaps in the system, and he slipped through them. Hospitals, colleagues, and administrators had either ignored the red flags or failed to put the necessary safeguards in place. His record should have followed him. Background checks should have prevented him from continuing his practice. But none of that happened. Instead, he resumed his career, performing surgeries, interacting with patients, and unbeknownst to anyone at the time, continuing his crimes. This was no longer just a case of one man's actions. This was a systemic failure. How many other professionals with dangerous pasts had been allowed back into positions of trust? And how do we prevent it from happening again? With the diaries as evidence, prosecutors wasted no time building a case against Dr. Le Scouarnec. The first trial was set to focus on 4 victims, including the 6-year-old girl who had bravely spoken up and set the investigation in motion. Inside the courtroom, the tension was suffocating. The charges were read aloud, each word heavier than the last. The diaries were presented, their chilling contents proving to be more than just disturbing accounts, but concrete evidence of what had been happening for decades. The defense attempted to downplay the significance of the journals, arguing that they were nothing more than fictional writings, private fantasies that had never been acted upon. But this argument fell apart quickly. How do you argue against pages upon pages of handwritten confessions? How do you justify evidence that lines up with real-life survivors who never knew they were documented in a secret ledger? The prosecution methodically dismantled every attempt to shift the blame, leaving the court with one undeniable truth. These were not just words, these were crimes. The survivors, some speaking publicly for the first time, faced their abuser and told their stories. Their testimonies were raw, emotional, and heartbreaking. But this was only the beginning. As the trial progressed, the number of potential victims continued to grow. Would this case finally bring the justice that had been denied for so long? Or was it already too late for those whose lives had been irreversibly changed? Then, in 2020, the moment arrived. The court delivered its verdict. Dr. Joël Le Scouarnec was found guilty and sentenced to 15 years in prison. For many, this was a moment of victory, justice finally served. But for others, the sentence felt inadequate for the scale of his crimes. 15 years? For a man who had spent decades destroying lives. Was that enough? And then came another twist. More victims were still coming forward. More cases were being investigated. More evidence was being uncovered. This wasn't just the end of one case, it was the beginning of something much larger. Authorities now faced an overwhelming question. Had they only scratched the surface of his crimes? As investigators looked deeper, they realized that the true extent of what Dr. Le Scouarnec had done may never be fully known. And the most terrifying thought of all, how many more just like him are still out there? As investigators dug deeper into Dr. Joël Le Scouarnec's past, the sheer scale of his crimes became overwhelming. At first, there were only a handful of known victims, but as more people came forward and the contents of his diaries were analyzed, the numbers began to skyrocket. 50 victims, then 100, then 200. And by the time authorities compiled all available evidence, the list included nearly 300 individuals. 300 lives forever changed. 300 people who had unknowingly been part of his web of abuse. This was no longer just a criminal case, it had become a national scandal. The French public, already horrified by the details of the trial, now had to face an even more disturbing question. How does one man harm so many people for so long without being caught? How had hospitals, colleagues, and even law enforcement failed to recognize the warning signs? How had a convicted offender been allowed to return to his profession without deeper scrutiny? This was not just about Dr. Le Scouarnec anymore. It was about a system that allowed him to keep going year after year unchecked. And if he had managed to stay hidden for decades, how many more like him were still out there, operating in plain sight? For years, parents placed their trust in Dr. Le Scouarnec, believing they were leaving their children in the hands of a skilled, compassionate professional. When their child needed surgery, they were relieved to have such an experienced doctor in charge. But what if the very person meant to protect them was the one causing harm? Imagine looking at your family's trusted doctor and learning years later that he had been keeping detailed, handwritten records of his actions. Imagine sitting across from someone you once admired, only to find out that beneath the white coat he was a predator. For many of these families, the betrayal cut deeper than words could describe. How many children had been left alone with him in an examination room? How many parents had unknowingly thanked the man who had harmed their loved ones? The weight of guilt was unbearable. Some blamed themselves. Should they have noticed something sooner? Should they have asked more questions? Others turned their anger toward the hospitals and institutions that had allowed him to continue working despite his past conviction. But ultimately, one question loomed over them all. If someone had stopped him earlier, how many children could have been saved? As survivor after survivor came forward, one disturbing pattern emerged. There had been warnings. There had been suspicions. There had been opportunities to stop him. Yet nothing was done. Some people had spoken up. Colleagues had noticed strange behavior. Patients had felt uneasy around him. Some survivors had even tried to tell someone years ago, only to be dismissed, ignored, or not believed. Why? Was it fear? Was it negligence? Or was it something worse? Dr. Le Scouarnec had been protected by the layers of his profession. He was a doctor, and doctors were respected, trusted, untouchable. He had operated within a system that wasn't designed to expose predators, it was designed to protect reputations. Hospitals had been more concerned with avoiding scandal than ensuring safety. Colleagues had looked the other way, unwilling to risk their own careers by speaking up. And in the end, his victims had paid the price. How many others in different hospitals in different countries were being shielded by this same silence? And more importantly, what will it take to finally break it? For years, silence had been their only companion. But now, the survivors of Dr. Joël Le Scouarnec were finally stepping forward, breaking the chains that had held them captive in their own trauma. Some had spent their entire lives questioning themselves, did that really happen? Was I imagining it? The weight of doubt had been unbearable. Others had tried to speak up years ago, only to be dismissed, ignored, or told they were mistaken. Now, with his crimes exposed, they were being heard for the first time. But speaking out came at a cost. How do you describe something so painful? How do you stand before the world and say, this happened to me? For many, the hardest part wasn't just recounting the past. It was the realization of how much had been stolen from them. The childhood they never fully had. The relationships they struggled to trust. The years lost to fear, confusion, and shame. Each survivor's story was unique, yet they shared a common thread. Dr. Le Scouarnec had taken something from them that they could never get back. And now the world was listening. But as their voices grew louder, another question began to surface. Would speaking out be enough to create real change? When Dr. Le Scouarnec's sentence was announced 15 years in prison, it was met with a mix of relief and frustration. 15 years. For some, it felt like justice had been served. The man who had spent decades manipulating his position of power was finally behind bars. His reign of terror was over. But for many survivors, it wasn't enough. How do you measure the damage done to nearly 300 lives? How do you equate decades of suffering with a sentence that will one day end? Some feared that 15 years meant he could one day walk free, that he could blend back into society just as he had before. And beyond him, what about the system that allowed him to thrive? Justice wasn't just about locking one man away. It was about stopping it from ever happening again. And so, the next battle began not just against one criminal, but against the system that had protected him for so long. As the public learned the full scale of the case, outrage erupted. How had this been allowed to happen? A convicted man had been permitted to return to his job, performing surgeries, interacting with vulnerable patients, all while hiding his dark double life. Hospitals had failed. Authorities had failed. The entire system had failed. But who should be held accountable? Should the hospitals that had hired him face consequences? Should there be laws preventing convicted offenders from ever returning to medical professions? Should doctors undergo deeper background checks and psychological evaluations? For many, the answer was clear. The system needed to change. This case had proven that safeguards weren't strong enough, that predators could hide in plain sight, protected by titles, prestige, and the reluctance of institutions to acknowledge failure. If Dr. Le Scouarnec had been stopped in 2005, hundreds of victims could have been spared. Now, the only question that remained was, would this case finally force change? Or when the outrage faded, would the cycle start all over again? The revelations from Dr. Joël Le Scouarnec's case sent shockwaves through France, forcing the country to confront the gaps in its systems that had allowed him to operate for so long. The government could no longer ignore the urgent need for reform. Laws began to shift. Discussions on child protection, hospital hiring policies, and background checks for medical professionals intensified. There was pressure to ensure that anyone with a past conviction, especially related to crimes against children, could never work in a position of authority again. But was it enough? Hospitals scrambled to review their procedures, re-examining how they handle complaints, monitor staff, and prevent future cases from slipping through the cracks. Medical boards faced tough questions. How many other cases like this had been buried? How many warnings had gone unheard? Public awareness campaigns encouraged survivors of abuse to come forward, ensuring that their voices would no longer be ignored. It seemed like real change was happening, but laws and policies can only do so much. At the heart of it all remained one terrifying truth. Predators don't disappear just because rules change. Would this case be enough to prevent another one like it? Or would history repeat itself with a different name in a different town under the same broken system? Dr. Joël Le Scouarnec's diaries were more than just records. They were a window into his mind. Psychologists pored over the pages, analyzing the motivations, the patterns, and the disturbing level of detail. Was he simply a compulsive predator who couldn't control his urges? Was he a narcissist who believed he was untouchable? Or was it something even darker? One thing was clear: he had meticulously planned everything. Unlike impulsive offenders who act on opportunity, his crimes were methodical. He had created an entire system within his own mind, calculating, documenting, controlling. The act of writing everything down suggested something chilling. He wanted to preserve his actions, to relive them, to keep a record of his own power. Some experts theorized that this wasn't just about harming others, it was about control. Control over his victims, control over his profession, and most disturbingly, control over the truth. For years, he had written his own version of reality. Now the world was reading it, and finally, he had lost control. But one question remained unanswered. If he hadn't been caught in 2017, how much longer would he have continued? Nearly 300 victims. That was the official number. But was it the full truth? Experts believed there could be many more. Some victims might never come forward, either out of fear, shame, or simply because they don't even know what happened to them. How many names were buried in those pages, never to be spoken aloud? How many people had their lives altered by him, but will never realize it? The case had shattered the silence around one man's crimes, but silence still lingers where voices have not yet spoken. And the most haunting question of all: if there are more victims out there, how will they ever find justice? As the legal process neared its conclusion, one major question remained: would Dr. Joël Le Scouarnec serve his full sentence? The court had sentenced him to 15 years in prison, but in many cases, prisoners in France can be released early for good behavior. Could he ever walk free? For survivors, the thought was unbearable. A man responsible for the suffering of nearly 300 people, released back into society. While some argued that justice had been served, others feared that 15 years wasn't enough for the magnitude of his crimes. How do you put a time limit on the destruction of so many lives? And even if he never physically harmed another person again, the damage he had done would never be erased. Authorities faced difficult decisions. Should he remain under strict surveillance even after his sentence? Should France introduce tougher sentences for crimes of this nature? Should institutions be held accountable for allowing him to operate for so long? One thing was certain: his case had changed the country. But as long as the possibility of his release existed, one chilling thought remained. What if it happens again? Even with Dr. Joël Le Scouarnec behind bars, one question loomed over everyone. How many more like him are out there? For every predator exposed, how many remain hidden, protected by power, reputation, and silence? This case had revealed deep flaws in the system, flaws that had allowed a known offender to return to his profession. How many others had slipped through those same cracks? How many doctors, teachers, coaches, people in positions of trust had gone unchallenged, unnoticed? And how do we stop them before it's too late? For survivors, justice was more than just a prison sentence. It was about ensuring no one else had to suffer in silence. But true change wouldn't come until silence was no longer an option, until victims were believed the first time they spoke up, until systems prioritized safety over reputation, until those who enable predators faced the same consequences as those who commit the crimes. Because in the end, the most chilling truth isn't just what one man did. It's the realization that he was able to do it for decades. And unless real change happens, it will happen again.